Welcome to our first road trip and our detailed lecture today on the Mississippian culture. Today we're at actually one of their sites called Etowah, an ancient town that once housed thousands of people. Behind me is what's representative of this Mississippian culture, the large earthen mounds, right? This one is about 20 meters high or 63 feet high. The Mississippian culture were not a civilization, right? They were similar to the ancient Greeks in that they were a society that was spread very far and wide, but was linked by no government, right? One single leader or government, right? There were many city-states, all with the same culture and religious identity, very similar to the ancient Greeks themselves. Now, the Mississippians existed all over the eastern United States and were the dominant power in the eastern U.S. before European contact. And their trading system went all over the continental United States, even getting to Mexico, all right? These people were simply fantastic, all right? They had no writing system. They had no ability to work with stone or much to do with metal, all right? But what they did have, were very successful at. These earthen mounds, right? They created these giant earthen mounds. They also created an enormous trading network that stretched an extremely vast continent. And they had very impressive artwork, which we'll take a look at now. The Mississippian culture existed from 800 AD all the way to 1600 AD and covered most of the eastern United States. This was a culture that lasted a very long time, and its art shows the sophistication of that culture. Here we can see the pottery of the Mississippian people. Specifically, these are the ones from Etowah here. And we can tell over time that the designs get more sophisticated. And that's an excellent sign that a civilization is advancing. Here we see what you might call the original potheads here. These effigies were created, and they'd have things within them. Beans, beads, something along those nature would be in the potheads, and they would be on the end of a totem and be shaken and making a noise during some sort of a ceremony. But as you can tell, they're very detailed objects. These here might be some of the more interesting ones. These effigies here, many of these existed, although many haven't been found yet, or have been stolen or robbed over the centuries. But these effigies would be placed within burials, right? They'd be put in graves. You can see an image of it happening here. They'd be placed within graves. Now, we can only speculate as to what the purpose of these effigies were, except we could tell by the detail of them that they were very significant and very important. It could be that, and this is all just supposition here, because we don't really know the purpose of these effigies. They could be guardian spirits, right? And they could be placed in the grave to guard the deceased in the afterlife. It could also be that these effigies were created in likeness of the deceased. For another further theory, is that obviously these people were aware that the body rots away, and perhaps they believed that in the underworld, right, once the body decayed, the soul would then have nowhere to go. And so perhaps these effigies were made for the soul of the deceased to vacate and find a new host within this effigy for their life in the underworld. Again, those are all just theories. We can only speculate due to lack of evidence. This here is an interesting mask, and one seen commonly amongst Mississippian peoples. The false antlers here and the the mask made of wood. And this would have been worn by the chieftain or high priest. In this society, the chieftain was the high priest. So it may have been worn by him or a lesser priest in some sort of ceremony or ritual dance. But we could only speculate as to its purpose. The religion of the Mississippian people is one that very little is known actually about. We have a figure known as the Birdman, we'll show you here, who appears in much of the art of the Mississippian people. He appears to be the primary deity. He'll also be known by another name as Redhorn or the Morning Star. And he's called this because he actually summons the sun each morning. He brings the sun up from the underworld or the land of the dead each morning into the land of the living. And the religion is based on something we're very familiar with, right? The idea that there is a lower world or an underworld, a land of the dead, a middle world where the living humans reside, and of course an upper world where the deities live. Here we can see a feathered mask here that would be worn by the chieftain, right? And this is generally the style of the chieftain slash head priest, and that he would try to emulate or look as much like the Birdman deity as he possibly could, right? He would dress like him and try to appear as much as possible in the visage of him. So it's very possible that he's either just emulating it, wearing his priest garb is this because that is the deity, or he actually believes, and the people actually believes, that he himself, the chieftain himself, is the Birdman, or a reincarnation of the Birdman.
Now we have what looks like just a simple field here, but it demonstrates what these people did for leisure and entertainment. This was once home to a ginormous field that people would play stickball, similar to lacrosse or the game called chunky, all right? These people would come from miles and miles away. Even opposing tribes, enemies of the Etowahs, would come here to sit and to watch the game and even participate in the game itself, right? These festivals would occupy this field. And when it wasn't being used for festivals or sport games, it was being used as a trade bazaar or market for the people of this once burgeoning city. So no evidence of human sacrifice has yet to be found at the city of Etowah, but that might possibly be only because only the smallest mound has been excavated. Only about 9% of this entire city has been excavated. We know for a fact that the majority of ancient Mississippian cultures did in fact practice human sacrifice.
The most prevalent evidence of human sacrifice amongst the Mississippian culture is present at Cahokia, of where the most excavations of any Mississippian culture site have occurred. Around 280 skeletons have been found of young women, right, that were placed in neat rows, lined in neat rows, and they didn't have signs of trauma, which suggests they were killed likely by strangulation or by bloodletting. In a separate burial pit, where they found about 40 men and women were found. They were killed by violent means, decapitation, suffering horrific bone fractures, right? Evidence shows that their nails were dug into the soil, suggesting that many of them were buried alive, right? And these, it goes to show that these people did practice human sacrifice. Now again, there hasn't been evidence found at Etowah of this, but again, only 9% of the site has actually been excavated.
Despite there being no human sacrifice present at Etowah that's been seen or discovered, you can see behind me This is no mere field, right? This is a moat. This is a protective barrier to keep out enemies. Enemies such as Moundville, present in Alabama, who was the chief rival of the Etowah people. They were also Mississippians, a part of the Mississippian culture. These moats would be 10 feet deep, right? And on these side walls, these earthen walls, would be 12-foot long sticks that would be sharpened, be spears at the end, like it would be palisades more or less, to keep the enemy from being able to get into the city. Moreover, right, to protect the city itself from invading armies, they planted many, many large trees, right? These large trees prevented enemy archers from being able to easily fire flaming arrows into the city itself, right? They couldn't get them over the trees. And that was what some of the precautions taken here at Etowah were to keep out enemy invaders. This suggests the importance of the civilization, right? That people were willing to go to war with them. More importantly, that many raiders would want to come here, suggesting they had something of wealth, right, that others wanted.
Here we can see the palisades, right, that I was speaking of, the walled city, the fortified city to keep out raiders and invaders. The cities themselves of the Mississippians could vary in size, from small villages to enormous cities. Cahokia, we'll take a look at here, was the largest of these, located in Illinois, right across the Mississippi River from St. Louis. The city itself reached its apex, it's believed, around 1100 AD, in which there was about 6 square miles of city here, with about 120 earthen mounds of various shapes and sizes. The population of Cahokia was believed to be around between 11 and 18,000 people, right, which would have been around the size of London at 1100 AD. You can see now what it might have looked like back in the day at its height. Then we'll take a look at Etowah now, which had over 140 buildings, at least 140 buildings on the site, in 3 large mounds. All right. The Mississippian peoples existed from around 800 AD to nearly 1600 AD. So it's a very large time span that these people existed, that this culture existed. The mound at Cahokia, right, was around 100 feet or 30 meters high, while the mound in Etowah was about 63 to 20 meters high.
Behind me here is a reconstructed wattle and daub house. This is a recreation of an Etowah building here. About 140 structures were found on this site, at least. So there's probably many, many more that were once here at a time for a city that once housed thousands of people. But you get the architectural style here, an idea of the architectural style used for the majority of the buildings here at Etowah. Now we'll take a look at some of the other types of architecture used by the Mississippian peoples for their buildings.
We can see the houses, some of these other houses the Mississippians built, and how they vary in style, despite say that these houses would have been of a good size. Even when we look at Europe, right, medieval Europe, these would have been a good sized house for people even back then in Europe.
So what happened to Etowah? What happened to the Mississippian culture? Well, the short answer is apocalypse. All right. The Spanish, as we know, were the first Europeans to explore southeastern America, right, or now United States. Going into Florida, they ventured north into Georgia, led by a man named Hernando de Soto, a conquistador or knight who came in search of gold. When he did so, he encountered many tribes. Some they fought with, others they peacefully traded with. Etowah, or Etowah, as the Spanish would call him, was one such site the Spanish traded very peacefully with. Right? They had a nice day. They traded, they talked, they discussed gold or lack thereof, and then went on their way. a nice first contact, if you will, with Europeans. The problem is the Spanish unwittingly carried with them diseases, zoonotic diseases. You see, the Europeans had long domesticated animals, something that hadn't happened here yet in Native America, in North America. And so the Europeans had carried with them diseases that were not present in humans over here in North America. And these were zoonotic diseases, terrible diseases that Native Americans had absolutely no immunity to, all right? And so these diseases were given unwittingly to everyone the Spanish came in contact with, and people dropped like flies, all right? That is how the Mississippian culture ended. When the Spanish came back decades later to check up on their old friends on another expedition, they came here and found a wasteland. They came here and found tribes, many different tribes, some calling themselves Creek, some calling themselves Cherokee, right? The Etowah civilization here, due to disease, after being ravaged by disease, fled their city, fled their civilization, and went back to being tribes once again, fragmented and became tribes that we now know all too well today, or have heard of, the Creek, the Cherokee, and up north, obviously, the many different tribes. Folks, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and you all have a great rest of your day.